Hi, I'm Michelle May. I'm here with Daniel Schmachtenberger, who's a researcher and think tank director with a background in ecology and nutrition. He's joined me here today to talk about veganism and animal rights. Thank you for joining us, Daniel.
Thank you for having me, Michelle.
I'd like to begin by asking you why you think that we should care about animals and why our dietary choices are so important.
Why we should care about animals is because we affect them, and it's important to know how we affect them and to be able to really take responsibility for that. The key for me is the relationship between sentience and sovereignty. Sentience is the capacity for something to feel, to suffer, to love, to want, and sovereignty is its freedom to direct its own life. And I think the essential insight on the topic of rights, whether we're talking about rights of other races, rights of women, rights of any group that has been marginalized, rights of other species, is that if something is sentient, it should be acknowledged as sovereign. If something has the ability to suffer or to experience joy, if it can feel, it should get to direct its own life according to what would optimize those feelings for it. And earlier in human history, we've subjugated other people in ways that we no longer find okay, through slavery, through patriarchal domination. And when we progressively came to recognize, hey, women or people with another skin color or kids, they feel as much as we do and their life matters and they should have the same sovereign rights, it's really the next extension of that now to all the other animal species. And empathy is really this progressive process of recognizing that things that are different than us have similarities with us. At first, if someone had a different skin color than us, we could make them different enough that we could torture them and think it was okay. And with more awareness and empathy, we started to recognize there was actually more similarity. There was enough similarity between us that we could relate to their experience, and then it wasn't okay to inflict an experience on them we wouldn't want. And the truth is, even though animals are very different than us in many ways, they share hurt and suffering and love and playfulness, and depending upon where in the evolutionary spectrum they are, they share those things more or less, but the ability to feel pain is all the way down to the most fundamental animals. And recognizing that, we need to take responsibility for how we affect them.
Okay. If animals eat other animals, do you believe that nature is violent and immoral?
When we look at how we should live as humans that have the ability to choose to live in very different ways than we lived ancestrally, sometimes we look to nature for models, and it's important to understand which models are relevant and which ones aren't relevant, right? And so in the animal kingdom, we see predatory cycles. We see predation, and some animals eating plants and some animals eating other animals, and we see that's actually part of the balance of the whole system, right? That the animals that are eating plants actually don't regulate their own consumption and they don't regulate their own reproduction, so they would breed themselves beyond the carrying capacity of their environment, and the process of prey checking them is actually what creates a dynamic balance, right? And so when many look at that, they say, hey, survival of the fittest is what drives evolution, and it's part of what drives balance, and it's a part of nature, and that we're part of the food chain. We're animals, we're part of the biosphere, and that we should embrace being part of that. And there's a couple distinctions that are really key, I think, to note here. One is, it's kind of a really subtle scientific and philosophic point, is that the reason there's predation in nature, the reason there's a predatory process, and it is violent, right? And any animal that is on the prey side of the equation will acknowledge that really clearly, is because the prey animals can't self-regulate sustainably because they don't have the cognitive capacities, the neurophysiologic capacities to be able to assess what the carrying capacity of their environment is, and then say, hey, we're going to stop reproducing now, or we're going to slow reproduction rates, we're going to slow our consumption rates to actually live sustainably. And so when they start to outbreed their own environmental capacities, and there starts to be a scarcity of resource for the creatures, some of the creatures start to actually prey on each other because there isn't enough of the base materials anymore, and there's too many of them. They go into competition as a function of that scarcity, as a function of their inability to modulate their own sustainability, and then those ones have an evolutionary niche where they evolve in the direction of predatory kind of animals. So the predatory process arises out of the unsustainability of or the incapacity of a species to be self-sustaining. So that violence is actually necessary for the species to continue, right, and for the biosphere to continue. And so it's not like it's just a good thing, it's a necessary thing, right? And in nature it is a necessary thing. With humans, there's this fascinating thing that evolution drives more complexity, more complex ability to respond. And so we see from reptilian nervous system that's kind of on-off modulated responses that experience physiologic pain and pleasure in those response capacities, to mammalian nervous systems and their ability for emotion, to neocortex primates and dolphins, porpoises, etc., and their capacity for cognition, to then with humans and the prefrontal cortex and the capacity for abstraction. We're the first creature that has this abstraction capacity. We can actually assess our environment's carrying capacity. We don't do a good job of this yet, but we could assess, hey, how many of us could really fit here based on the resource per capita needs? And then we could modulate the efficiency of how we consume and actually modulate our own reproduction to stay within those carrying capacity limits so that we didn't need ongoing violence to check our numbers. Now, this is a capacity we have neurophysiologically because of our prefrontal cortex and uniquely human capacities, but it's not one we've exercised well yet. We're still breeding irrespective of the resource limits of the planet, and we're still consuming irrespective of the unsustainable resource limits of the planet. And as a result, some humans start preying on other humans in different ways, right, through all kinds of pathological competition. It's an important note, though, that we don't have to do this, right? And that we're actually at the point right now where, because of our data harvesting capacities and really our ability to assess planetarily things that we couldn't even a few generations ago because of our technological capacities, that we really are, for the first time, capable of saying how many people can the Earth support sustainably in harmony with the rest of the biosphere, and how do we consciously self-regulate as a whole species how we relate to the planet sustainably, where there's no need for a predation process continuing. And what's so exciting about that to me is that we're the first species that really has the capacity to end the need for violence. And to really step up to that capacity is such an exciting thing.
Yeah, definitely. What about eating plants, since they're also live organisms?
If we're going to kill a plant to eat, or we're going to kill an animal to eat, is it still the fundamental truth that we have to kill to eat and it's all the same? Are we still being speciesist to, pick killing plants over animals? And I think there's actually some core distinctions here that are really worth making. There's an evolutionary purpose for pain. And that really the ethic that we're looking at here is cause no harm, or cause as little harm as possible, to the point of view of a sentient experience, right? Shattering a rock apart, if the rock doesn't feel anything, isn't an act of violence, even though there was harm from one point of view, but the rock wasn't experiencing, as far as we know about rocks, wasn't experiencing harm. So when we say cause no harm or cause the least amount of harm possible, it's two things capable of experiencing that harm, right? And so there's an evolutionary purpose for pain, which is to be able to move away from something harmful to the organism. Okay, so in all animals, our sensory nerves, nerves that take in information, and our motor nerves, our nerves that can then respond to that information, are intimately tied, and they actually co-evolve going up the evolutionary ladder. And so notice that whenever there's a pain response, it will always trigger a motor response of one of two kinds. So either you touch something hot or sharp and you move away from it, or you have a sprained ankle and you make sure not to step on it or not move into it. But the purpose of that pain is to protect the organism because of some response capacity, and that response capacity involves our movement capacity, right? So this is a place where plants and animals fundamentally differ. Plants don't have real-time movement capacity, right? A sunflower can track the sun over the course of a day very slowly, but they don't have the ability to move away from something harmful or to stop moving in some way that's harmful to them. And so there's no evolutionary purpose for pain for them. And it's important to understand that the process of experiencing pain, it's physiologically mediated and it requires a lot of energy. So in us, the pain process is mediated through acetylcholine crossing synaptic gaps, producing an opiate response, an adrenal and sympathetic response. There's a lot of energy required to experience pain, and that was only selected for because it was advantageous that the creatures who experienced it moved away from harm better or didn't move into harm better, so they actually got through, reproduced better, and natural selection selected for their ability to feel pain, right? If a tree or a plant, the key to how they can gather energy from sunlight, and none of the other animals can, has to do with their ability to be rooted and be able to gather a huge amount of nutrition from the soil, and to be able to support this huge base of foliage that can do all of this photoreception, right? And so because of that, they give up the ability for movement, and with it, there really is no evolutionary purpose for pain, wouldn't have been selected for. That's the first thing. The second thing is that when we look in other animals, we see in their nervous system opiate receptors on their neurons, which have to do with the chemistry of modulating the pain process. And we see that on every animal, all the way down to hinge valve creatures like clams. And they all have the same kinds of opiate structures that indicate the same kinds of pain processes because they have an ability to respond. And the clam is kind of the most simple one, which is they can close up if there's something potentially harmful. That means they have to experience harm, right? Experience something subjectively, and they can open in response to positive stimuli, or at least a lack of negative stimuli. In the plant kingdom, we don't see anything like an opiate kind of chemistry, and we don't see anything response-wise like that. Now, the book, The Secret Life of Plants, and a number of books and studies that have been done that show that plants do show some kind of electrical response to being cut or to other plants being cut or burned in their presence, doesn't mean plants have no response capacity. But their response capacity is very, very limited relative to animals' response capacity. And so the main kind of thing is if a plant is being cut, it can't stop that from happening, cannot move away from it, can't pull into its turtle shell, can't close its clamshell, can't. What it can do is it can add resins to the sap in that area to be able to stop the loss of sap, right? And so when we see the electrical responses, galvanic responses in plants, we see that they're responding, and we can anthropomorphize that and call it plant screaming, but we don't really see any basis to suspect that the plant is having a subjective experience of pain. Does this mean that plants have no subjective experience at all, no qualia? This is actually at the edge of our scientific knowledge. We don't know. Most neuroscientists say no, plants don't have any experience. Some people have reason to think that they do have experience, but we don't have any reason to think that there's an evolutionary relevance for them or any indication of an actual pain or kind of suffering process, because they couldn't respond to it and they don't show those signs. So that's a major distinction, right? In the process of saying, hey, if I'm taking a plant life here, it's still a life, but am I inducing suffering? And all the indications we have indicate no, and even if so, in a radically different way, right? The other thing that's worth noting is that even if there was some pain or suffering that the plant experienced, when we are eating animals, the animals had to eat plants, and there's some entropy, there's some energy loss in that process, so it's going to take many pounds of plant vegetation to produce a pound of animal vegetation that then the person could eat. And so by supporting the supply and demand chain of eating that animal, you're causing the harm to the animal plus that towards however many other plants. So that there's really kind of no water held in that argument.
We all know that factory farms are terrible, but what about eating animals that come from free-range farms or from hunting?
If all we succeeded at was stopping the factory farms, I would be so happy. Because an animal that is living in a natural environment and really getting to experience its sovereignty and its direction of its life, and then gets killed hopefully quickly, it's a radically different experience than an animal that is really enslaved in poor to terrible to atrocious conditions for its whole life, and then killed in very often a very brutal way. And so if we only made that shift, that would be so humongous, right? So much of the atrocity would be addressed. Then the question comes, is that the only shift worth making? Is that all the shift? And for me, as much respect as I have for, say, the Native American kind of ethic, I also noticed that in areas where there was more, pre-agriculture, in areas where there was more natural edible plant life, there was less animal consumption. And in areas where there was less natural edible plant life, there was more animal consumption, because that's what the people had to do to adapt and live there, right? We totally understand. Post-agriculture, where we have the ability to grow everything we need plant-wise, then if that produces less suffering than, less harm than killing more sentient creatures, then is there really a justification for continuing the animal thing? And for me, there isn't. And we talk about the idea of humane slaughter, and it really is an oxymoron. And all you have to do to recognize that is ask, would you be okay being on the other side of it? And in morality, there's a famous test called the pie slice theorem. When we're asking is something really ethical, is something fair? And it's like, okay, well, you slice the pie, you pick what the two sides are, and I get to pick which one I want. Or I slice and you pick, but that way we avoid bias. So we got to just ask, are we setting up a dynamic for how we tend to animals where we'd be okay being in their position? And if the answer is no, I wouldn't want a life where I was taken care of pretty well and then murdered quickly, then the answer is they wouldn't want that either. And if it was necessary, then we'd have to look at justifying it. But if it's not necessary, there's really no justification for it. And that really is a key to get, is that no animal has ever voluntarily put their head on a chopping block, and if they knew that was coming, would do everything in their power to get away from it. And just because we have the power to take their life away, do we have the right? And if we need to, if there's a situation where we are in a survival situation, we have no other resources and we're going to die or they're going to die, it's a totally different story, right? And if someone really didn't know how to be healthy otherwise, it's a different story. But if it's simply a preference for us, but it's the whole possibility for life for them, then I don't think we can ethically justify that.
And I think that's something that you find consistent through all forms of life, from the most complex to the most basic, is that every animal wants to live. At the end of the day, there isn't any animal that doesn't want to have life and to experience life.
Well, it's the fundamental impulse of life, of biology, is to continue, right, and to propagate. And when we think about our desires, everything we want and everything we don't want, it's all contingent upon life, right? And without that, everything else is gone. So their desire to mother their children and to be social and to experience anything that they might want to experience is on the foundation of their ability to live. And so to take that away for just, I like the way it tastes, right? Or something that is so surface in our hierarchy of needs, and it's at the core of their hierarchy of needs, means that we have to make their life so unimportant in our eyes that their whole right to life is worth less than something relatively trivial to us. And if we're willing to take another feeling life form and make their whole experience that trivial, then there's a bleed over effect where we start doing that with other people, right? We start doing that with anything else. We start thinking of the rest of life as a commodity for us rather than other sovereign life forms with their own right to life. We're not thinking about what does it want? What does it feel? What is its right to life? How can I support it having a full life experience in this universe? It's what is in it for me, and even if it requires harming it or hurting it, how can I get what I want out of it? When we start thinking that way in any area, it leads to a way of thinking that bleeds over to commoditizing all life. And we can see that being like an underlying way of being for all of the problems in the world right now.
What about dairy and eggs and other animal products?
I grew up on a heavy meat diet and loved animals and didn't recognize those were incongruent. And then I saw a slaughter truck and I saw animals in the most terrible conditions, and it was really horrifying for me. I was 9, I asked my parents about it, and they said that's where hamburgers came from, and that was the beginning of my animal rights journey and the last time I ate meat. And I found John Robbins' book, Diet for a New America, and got into it and got into PETA's work. But I still ate dairy and eggs for some years. It wasn't until I was 15 that I became vegan, because in my mind I was like, well, I'm not hurting the animal, right? But not right. There's a couple things that are important to note here on the dairy topic first. If we look at factory farms, all animals in factory farms, whether we're consuming their body or byproducts from their body, are seen as a commodity where we're trying to maximize the output of the sellable commodity for the least amount of money in, which means the least amount of care, space, etc. And there's just really grotesque cruelty throughout the whole process. If you want to have a look at what dairy cows' lives are like, the hormones that they're pumped full of to produce extra milk, the way their babies are taken from them early. I mean, on and on. Have YouTube videos on what the life of industrial dairy looks like. It's nothing like the small farms that people imagine. But then let's even go to that small farm model, right? Here's the fundamental challenge with dairy, even if it's done as well as it can be done, is in order for a cow to be producing milk, it has to have a baby, and the milk is intended for the baby. If the baby gets to drink the milk, then we aren't getting the commodity from it that we can sell, and yet we still have to pay for the feed to support that cow. And so we take the cows or the goat or whatever it is away from the mom, either at the very beginning or prematurely, and they get raised on formula so that we can get the milk. And that's all of the developmental problems for the baby cow, all the emotional issues, you know, that would develop between the two of them. That's a fundamental, unavoidable kind of ethics issue right there. And then the second thing is that half of those babies are going to be male cows. And that means that even if this is a dairy where the female cows could grow up and become part of this dairy, the male cows can't be part of this dairy. And again, there's a cost to support their life, and that cost can't be justified if there's no return on investment there, so they all get sold to slaughter, whether they're slaughtered there or slaughtered somewhere else. So there really is no dairy without slaughter, right? The fact that the milk requires babies and that the babies, half are going to be male, guarantees slaughter in the process. In the modern industrial version, most of that looks like veal and some of the most terrible kinds of animal cruelty, but even in the kindest versions of it, slaughter is intimately tied with it. And so I don't see any way to do dairy that doesn't support things that, again, have that same fundamental ethic of you have to make their life matter so much less for something relatively trivial for us. When we look at eggs, again, commercial egg farming is as atrocious as every other form of commercial animal husbandry. But let's imagine that we're talking about a local little farm. And first, I do want to state that if something says farm fresh eggs or cage-free eggs, that doesn't mean that it's not industrial farming. You can have cage-free, meaning they're not in battery cages, but they're still packed into the tiniest environment, etc. So if you're thinking that you're doing eggs that come from a healthy little farm, you've really got to double check what the sourcing on that is. If someone is in the graduation process of eating less animal products, they're kind of having a wake up on that, and yet they don't feel totally ready for whatever reasons, nutritional or otherwise, to be 100% vegan yet, eggs are the thing that I would be happiest with them to eat, as a transitional food. Eggs from a local, small, sustainable kind of farm. And here's kind of the whole breakdown with regard to that. If chickens or whatever animal you're getting eggs from, but most commonly chickens, if they're allowed to have a natural life where we're not constraining it too much, then they're going to be mating, and those are all going to be fertilized, and they're going to want to protect those eggs, not get away from them. You're going to be taking animals that would otherwise, taking eggs that would become animals otherwise, and so there's the ethic kill thing in that, and that's an ethical problem on the same kind of order as the previous ones. If you keep the rooster away from the chickens, then it's unfertilized eggs, and there's not a huge kind of ethical harm to it intrinsically, but I'll tell you where kind of the boundary issues are here. We have to constrain that animal's life where we don't ever give it the opportunity to mate or to interact in what would really be a natural way for it. And even if we're doing that in what looks like a pretty kind environment, we still ask that would I trade places with them kind of thing. If you were kept in an environment where you were fed and you were well taken care of, but you were never allowed around the opposite gender or allowed to mate, you wouldn't consider that a good deal. It would be a better deal than a torturous one. And so anytime we relate with animals where we are modifying what their nature is to make them fulfill a purpose for us, there's ethical questions that come up. And honestly, these even extend into how we relate to what we call pets, horses, dogs, cats. When you start to get into issues like, hey, if they keep breeding and we're killing in shelters, this is a real problem. But neutering, would you want to be in a position where that had to happen? And these are really the boundary zone questions, right? These are, well, hey, is that animal getting some enhancement in its life experience because of us, or because it's been so domesticated and hybridized that it couldn't live in nature anymore? Is this now just something we have to deal with? And I'm going to say these are things to just feel into. But the bottom line here is that if you commodify an animal, where the animal or its byproducts becomes a commodity for us, then you are going to constrain the way that it lives, alter it in ways that it doesn't like, that you wouldn't like to trade places with, and there are going to be some ethical considerations around that. So, this is why I choose veganism. I don't eat eggs. If I was going to eat some animal product, it would be eggs. And I'd be really cautious about where they came from. And I think one point on this that's worth noting is that when someone says, you know what, for me, the ethics of eating an egg from a small farm, like I can live with that, it's important to then hold from a small farm and not just say, oh, I eat eggs, because there's one way of doing it that's okay. So that means when I'm out in a restaurant, I will, even though in a restaurant it's coming from, a battery cage. Or even if you say, you know what, I could hunt, I'm okay with that, but I'm really not okay with factory farms, then really own what that means when you go to a restaurant or a friend's house, right? And what your supply and demand means in that, to where if you're going to draw lines that aren't all the way at veganism, make sure you really hold to your own ethical lines.
What about eating honey? I think that honey is an animal byproduct that's the easiest for people that don't eat animal products for ethical reasons to still continue to eat, because of all of the issues with bees in terms of colony collapse and their inability to survive currently with GMOs and pesticides. Why is it still important for people to consider how and when they eat honey?
I think with honey there's a few reasons why people might think of it differently. One is, the more different another creature is than us, the harder it is for us to extend our empathy, because the harder it is for us to recognize that it might experience anything like we experience. And so empathy is a process of progressive widening to be able to recognize our interconnectedness and our sameness with more things, right? So extending all the way down to insects, insects don't necessarily elicit the same emotional responses in most people that mammals do. But it also doesn't mean that their life doesn't matter. And obviously we know that for the pollinators, our life depends on their life continuing in terms of maintaining the ecosystem and plant life. With regard to honey, the way that we relate to the bees and the way that we relate to their hive and the way that we gather the honey is what really determines the ethics of it in my eyes. Because I don't have an ethic around not interacting with animal products. I mean, if an animal died of natural causes and if someone wanted to eat it, I have no ethical issue. Whether it's a good idea or good for them or not, no suffering was caused for doing that. I have an ethic around causing unnecessary harm, right? And so in the process of creating honey, very oftentimes there's the bees are commodified in a way where the colony is damaged, bees are killed, there's no real respect for their life process, and that's through how the antibiotics are pumped into them. It's through the process of smoking them out to get them to move from one hive to gather the honey. But there are beekeeping practices that recognize that bees are surplus creators. They're one of the few things in nature that create surplus, and that even if they have more honey than they're going to use for a long time, they just keep doing it. It's what they do, and that we can take from that surplus without really bothering their life, without harming them. If that's the beekeeping practice, I have no problem with it. And if that's really supports people to support bees, it happens to be that those practices also go along with what will help bees resist colony collapse disorder. Much of the colony collapse disorder has to do with very hybridized species of bees that have less robust immune systems, because we've hybridized them for being able to pollinate very productively specific kinds of plants and like that. Obviously it has most to do with the neonicotinoid pesticides and other factors that have affected them. So the organic farming of bees that both keeps them off of pesticide crops, that has a diverse variety of bee species or less hybridized bee species, and that harvests the honey in a more considerate way to them, I don't have an ethics issue with, and I actually think is a good example of human-animal symbiosis, where we get to mutually benefit each other.
But again, if a human is going to choose to consume honey, they need to stand the line and be certain that they're only eating honey that comes from bees that were treated fairly.
And that's usually going to say raw, it's going to say organic, and typically if you can find locally produced honey, you've got a lot of nutritional benefits that come in terms of pollen inoculation and like that for many people with locally produced honeys. But if you can even go check out how they do it, that's a great thing.
Yeah, definitely. What should someone do if they're struggling to stay healthy on a vegan diet?
there are people that have an easier time being healthy with animal products than without them. There are a lot of people for whom that's the opposite, where as soon as they become vegan, they start feeling a lot healthier and issues clear up, and they lose weight and their athletics become better. Great. But for some people that have a harder time with it, it's my belief that almost all of them can learn how to be vegan just as healthfully. But for some people, getting a variety of amino acids is a little bit more of a challenge, because they actually have to source them intelligently. Because when you're eating an animal, the animal eats whatever a varied diet is and creates a complete protein in its muscle. And when you eat that complete protein, it breaks back down into all the essential amino acids. But if we're just eating, beans, legumes, the plant sources, that are mostly not complete proteins themselves, we have to make sure we have some variety of those. And if someone isn't paying attention to do that, they can start to get an amino acid imbalance. So for the most part, I would say learn more. And having a complete amino acid profile is one of the major things that matters for people. Also, long-chain fatty acids, specifically long-chain omega-3. In your flax oil and other seed oils, you're going to be getting a form of omega-3 called ALA, which is a shorter chain. The longer chain, EPA and DHA, come in meats because the animal synthesizes it, and in egg yolk. You can get those longer chains in algae and in algal oils. You can supplement with that. But your body can also convert it, but it converts it if your blood sugar is balanced. If your blood sugar isn't balanced, you have high resting insulin, it's harder to convert it. And for so many people that are eating a higher starch, carbohydrate, sugar diet, then it's harder to convert those things. And then for other people, hem iron is one of those other challenges. And again, there are vegan and vegetarian sources of iron that do convert well, and the B vitamins that are essential cofactors for the conversion of it. And so basically I would say study and learn about it. And almost everyone that I have ever interfaced with that was having a challenge with it, actually, to be honest, everyone that I have ever worked with who wanted to be vegetarian or wanted to be vegan for spiritual, ethical, moral reasons, and was having a challenge with their health, and they felt better when they ate some meat than not, when we figured out what was going on, what nutrients they were missing, and we figured out how to plant source those, they were all able to plant source them effectively. But to acknowledge the possibility that someone doesn't yet know how to do that, or maybe their body just can't, and I just want to be open to that possibility, then I'm not going to begrudge that person for eating an animal product, because if our goal is to minimize suffering, that means to the person also. And if they don't know how to not suffer, and I don't mean emotionally because they're craving it, because that's something that we can work with, but I mean physiologically, then what I would say is make sure that you are sourcing the things as ethically as possible, and that you're really doing the minimum amounts of those possible to really support you. And so if you can get by just with eggs from a local farm and you don't need to actually have a kill product, then the fact that you need some animal product doesn't automatically justify going to kill products. And if you do need a kill product and you find some, sustainably harvested thing, that doesn't mean go to factory farm things. And so I would just say, if you're in that place where you have an ethical care for the sentient experience of other life forms, and yet you don't know how to do it with your body yet, have compassion with yourself, so that you don't have to shame yourself for just not knowing how to do it yet, and make sure that you also hold the lines of, okay, if I need to do this, that doesn't mean that I automatically do a bunch of other things, right? Because very often there's a black and white kind of thinking where as soon as we have a real justification for part, we end up leaking beyond that. And then the other thing is, do continue to work to progress in that area and educate yourself and see if you can get to where, hey, I needed that, but now I don't anymore. And it's been my experience that with right education and support from other people that know more about it, I have yet to find anyone that hasn't been able to do it healthfully.
Yeah, I feel like it's a journey for everyone. I know for myself, when I initially became a vegan, I ate a lot more processed food, and learning to eat more whole foods, more whole grains and vegetables and fruits and things that don't have a lot of other ingredients in them has really helped me thrive on a vegan diet.
Yeah, what someone replaces the meat with is a big deal, because if they were eating meat that was a lot of, say, pre-processed fast food, whatever, because they're not really in the food prep way of mind, and so now they're still doing kind of pre-processed, etc., that means that it's probably going to be mostly all grain products that they're replacing it with, and now they're doing a bunch of breads and cereals and pastas, and that does mean that they are likely to get unstable blood sugar, that they are likely to get amino acid imbalances, and it's just not a healthy diet. So the protein has to be replaced with other things that contain protein, right? Which is complexes of beans and legumes and nuts and seeds, as well as potential algae, sea vegetables, fresh green vegetables. And so moving to vegan healthfully usually also means a movement towards more whole foods.
This is a question that really touches me personally, because as I've become more involved in veganism and become more interested in animal rights, it's really been difficult for me to retain the same amount of compassion for other humans, especially other humans that are hurting animals, as I do for other animals. Mm-hmm. So what is the best way to retain compassion for non-vegans while still promoting veganism?
My diet is what you would call vegan, but I don't really say often anymore I am a vegan. I'll say that I don't eat animal products. But identifying with any kind of label that excludes others ends up being the basis for limiting where our compassion extends, and then the basis for conflict. And so we want to not just be Americans or Christians or whatever limited group. We want to be citizens of the planet. And then we want to be not just human citizens, but earthlings, right? We want to continue to expand our sense of connectedness to the rest of life. And so I think there's even an identity level of I am a vegan or I'm an animal activist, as opposed to just compassion is a deep value for me. Everybody actually values compassion, even if their circle hasn't extended as far yet. They value it towards their kids, towards their pets, usually, right? Towards some things. And then we identify again what's the same between us, not what's different, and then we get to have a basis for building from there. Because with the exception of a few people that were raised by very conscious parents in this way, most of us ate meat while experiencing ourselves as ethical, caring, loving people. I did, right? And so the me today could easily be judging the previous me as uncaring, and I wasn't uncaring, right? I was unaware. And awareness requires more than just hearing, oh, animals suffer somewhere. It requires actually getting it to change a lifelong pattern that our whole family has done, our whole culture has done, almost everybody around us has done since we were a baby, right? And so we're looking at changing something profound. We're looking at changing how someone supports their own life, staying alive at like a multiple times a day basis, which is why the act of becoming vegetarian is such a huge one. It's because when you say, hey, the way that I support my staying alive, and something that I do every day, multiple times a day, and something that I've done since I was an infant, I'm going to change that, it's a huge change. And if you're changing it not just for you, if you change it for health reasons, it's different, because then you learn another health fad and it just keeps changing. But if you change a core way of how you support your life that started early on, and that everybody around you is still doing the other thing for the purpose of compassion, then you're saying that compassion is actually one of my core values, and I'm actually going to guide the core aspects of my life by that value. And that ends up bleeding over into so many other areas. You start recognizing, oh, my purchases affect things in ways I don't see. If I had to go to the factory farm to buy meat, I would never get the meat. But because the atrocity is somewhere else, I don't notice it. But what about landfills? Isn't it like that too? And now I'm going to start being conscientious of my waste, right? What about, did my shoes come from a place that was using child slave labor? Was animal testing involved in my cosmetics? And you start really taking responsibility for the effects that are invisible to us if we don't dig, but that are very real and that matter to somebody else. And that act of saying compassion and responsibility for that compassion come together as the core of my life, that I'm actually not just going to have compassion where I care but I don't do anything about it, but I'm going to have compassion and I'm going to act on it. And that becomes a central defining thing about who I am. That's such an essential shift. And it's my belief that everybody wants to have their life be a positive impact on others' lives as they get more informed and they get more sensitized. And that those who are capable of causing more harm, whether it's to animals or anything, is both because of a lack of awareness, a lack of resources for other opportunities, and because of their own hurts and wounds that have shut their empathy down. And so it's really a process of helping people to resensitize and to have new resources and strategies and to have deeper awareness, which means that going to attack them is the exact opposite of what would help, right? Recognizing our sameness with them, recognizing the goodness that's there, and then helping to both heal and offer new strategies is what's relevant.
I think that's a great point to close on, and I really appreciate you being with me today. I really look forward to delving deeper into these topics with you and learning more about veganism.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm really excited about your blog and that you're sharing this with people.
Great, thanks.